little bit, and we'll also follow up over email for that as well. So let's introduce today's presenters. Greg Zaguda is mStoner's most senior technical consultant and head of our analytics practice. Greg has provided technical leadership and project management on software teams for projects from e-commerce websites to business intelligence implementations. And Piero is CEO and founder of the digital marketing and web content management company Terminal 4. He founded the company in 1996 and spearheaded Terminal 4's expansion throughout North America, Europe, and Australia. Piero specializes in advising and consulting colleges and universities to drive student recruitment and retention, alumni fundraising, research promotion, and he does all this by maximizing the effectiveness of those institutions' digital and content strategies. Piero, sounds like you have a pretty big job. I love
Keeps
it.
me
You
busy.
do a lot. Oh man, keeps you busy.
Keeps me busy.
All right, so today's session, of course, use that hashtag mStonerNow. Join me in the chat room. We're going to have a lot of fun. And to kick off that fun, we actually have our first giveaway. All right, so if everybody wants to open up their chat, that's where you can answer the question. So I'm giving everyone a second to do that. Now we've got a great question for you, and the winner is going to get an Amazon voucher. Huge thanks to Terminal 4 for providing that for us. So here we go, Greg. What's our question? What percentage of Amazon.com's revenue is generated by its recommendation engine? I'm sure we are all Amazon.com shoppers. I am so curious to hear what folks think. All right. Oh, I'm seeing some good guesses. 45, 60. Yvonne's just like Alexa.
Ooh,
Alexa's
I think
the
we have a
answer.
winner, do we?
Do we have a winner? Oh, I see some close answers. Here we Bill Keller, you were the first to guess it right. Bill, I'll be following up with a private message to get your mailing address, but 35% of Amazon.com's revenue is generated by personalized recommendations. That's a huge impact to their bottom line, and in fact, in 2016, their business saw a really big bump because of this personalized recommendation engine. So Piero, I'm going to turn this session over to you. I am really curious how higher ed is going to be able to get in on this personalization action.
Great, thanks very much, Mallory. It's definitely a huge topic at the moment, and I think certainly when we're out talking to a lot of universities, and we work with about 200 universities around the world, at the moment is like the biggest topic. Sometimes it's phrased as, you know, oh, we want to have the Amazon experience, but in practice, the Amazon experience is very, very different, I think, to what needs to be applied in higher ed. So today, it's really about bringing you through not just the ideas and to seed your minds with some ideas about what, how you can really benefit from implementing some personalization techniques or what's sometimes called content targeting. But what I would say is actually the more important elements. It's what are the prerequisites, the planning steps, and the sort of the thought process that you need to go through before you start looking at personalization and content targeting. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day, and I would definitely say that it's hard to just jump into this. And the stuff we're going to talk about today, you need to have certain things in place. You know, a good quality website that you can use as a base to start trying things out. You also need to have a good structure around content. And we're going to talk about some of those areas today. But I suppose, what is personalization? I suppose personalization, there's a short little description there that we have on screen. It's very much about, I suppose, delivering very, very individual results tailored based on what you know about the person, right? The way I see it, it's very much like having a conversation. You're talking to somebody. If you're just talking to them and not listening to what they're saying or their interests or their body language, the effectiveness of that conversation, I believe, won't be as strong as obviously you interpreting what you're hearing and the body language and all these other signals. So when it comes to online, and you know, we mentioned Amazon earlier on, but as you can imagine, in retail and e-commerce, this is huge. They look at not only what you're buying online, but also what you're potentially buying in the brick and mortar store. Hopefully some of them can join that up and actually then offer you things based on your particular needs. For example, they can see that, you know, you're buying um, baby products, and suddenly they see you're buying a lot of baby products. And then they go, okay, maybe that person's had a life event, and they tailor the information. So I suppose, how does this all work for higher ed? And what I want to move on to next is one thing you might not know is that our own, we actually have internal for our own poet laureate, Vincent O'Malley, and he wrote a blog post a while ago, but I think this sort of sums it up very much about often what I call like the university homepage carousel. And I think sometimes a symptom of you needing personalization is often the homepage carousel. Um, so as you can see, it actually rhymes very well. So well done, Vincent, on your fantastic poetry work. As you can see, read there, what it's really about is you're trying with the carousel often to try and cover everybody's specific needs. So what you're trying to do is you're saying, oh, well, look, actually, alumni need something. Um, we're doing some undergraduate student recruitment, and we have an open house or campus visit weekends coming up. And everybody starts coming to the digital marketing recruitment or marketing team, and they sort of say, oh, well, we're important, we need stuff on the website. So what ends up happening is and I think we've all seen this across universities around the world. um, what we have actually seen is that everybody tries to put everything on the homepage. So what ends up happening is you end up really having a situation where like your homepage becomes very, very, very cluttered with things that are actually have different, widely different target audiences. And I think that is the main challenge around that personalization can solve, is the whole issue around delivering the right message to the right person. So, um, and I think that's really, if you look at the business cases around all of this, there's really three main areas that we have seen the strongest engagement. As I said, probably I would say 50% of our new projects this year have a personalization or content targeting element to it. And I'd say this is something that's growing very, very quickly over the last. It's definitely something that I believe it's just becoming so important. The only reason I believe that the other projects aren't looking at this sort of area at the moment is because it's just a matter of getting their priorities right. So what they want to do is, there's no point, as I said earlier on, in going down into content targeting and going into stuff like that if you don't have, say, a responsive website or you don't have the resources to write good content. So looking at the business case there, I mentioned there's three types. And with all of this, which, as we're going to talk about later on, there's a measuring piece involved. If you're going to invest time in this, you want to show that there are results. And these three areas, particularly undergraduate and postgraduate student recruitment, absolutely fantastic uplifts we're seeing in conversion rates, particularly around calls to action, registering for campus visits, for even just sending through an inquiry and so on. Another big area, for example, is alumni fundraising. And alumni fundraising is an interesting one because I think it's a bit of a balance, right? If you're talking to potentially, if you're talking to prospective students and you're trying to do fundraising, sometimes I think you don't want to be too strong in one area, for example, the fundraising part, because it might put off potential students, perhaps. And the other one is staff and student engagement. Are you still trying to have your website also be your intranet? And I know certainly the trend this year is people trying to separate that out. But for example, if you know somebody is coming from your campus, and you can do that very, very easily, you might as well focus the content towards people who are already there on your campus. There's no point putting time into, for example, having the geography of the website being spent talking about undergraduate student recruitment and things like that. So looking at some data on the next slide here, there's a lot of data out there, and definitely I'll share some views on this as well. This is a particular market report, but obviously there's a very, very high perception, or sorry, there's very, very, I think even common sense will show that at the moment, potential students are really looking at your website and judging you. It's like, for me, I see it as being like you going onto an e-commerce site and judging the quality of a product. If the product isn't well described, accurately described, and you're not telling a story that's genuine and authentic, it's going to reflect poorly. So obviously it has a huge impact. In this case, in this survey, and I've seen similar figures in other surveys, 78% impact your website has on the perception of your institution by potential students. When you look at it then in the stats of the number of students who are applying the first visit, I've also heard data that says, like, they sort of make their mind up within the first 7 to 14 days, at least to put you onto a short list. And that can be up to 5 times, but this Marketo particular piece of research, and I've seen similar, it says you can have increases of conversion by up to, in this case, it was 42%. And we're seeing very, very similar, very, very similar data. We've had examples in 30% increases. We had one particular situation with a client where they had a 300% increase in conversion. Now, at the time, they were solving a few other things as well. I wouldn't say personalization just did it, helped here, but it's something that there's very strong. We actually haven't seen a negative effect. It's only been very positive effects on the impact that it can have. So looking at the examples in higher ed, just talking through some of the different types of personalization. So today's webinar, we did talk about, for example, talking about not just the types of personalization. We're going to talk a little bit about the strategy and how it impacts and how to implement it and the things to think of. But I want to think about and share with you some of the approaches that you can use and actually show you some examples. I've got one non-higher ed example, and then I'm going to show you some higher ed examples based on the Terminal 4 University, a prestigious university, very good value, great education. So I'm going to show you some examples there based on some different types of personas. But looking here at the different types, so all of this is around persona-based segmentation. What that means is I'm going to show you some examples where I now start to learn that somebody is interested in undergraduate courses or programs or degrees, whatever your institution calls them. And that could be, for example, they might be interested in a short summer program. And I'm going to show you some of that. The other one is what's called topic personalization based on a topic of content. Now, what this could mean is, the person is interested in undergraduate studies, but then maybe you've then learned that they're interested in engineering. So now it's not about changing your whole website to suddenly be engineering and be showing cogs instead of every icon or bullet point suddenly turning into a cog or whatever, just to try and connect with them. It's about very subtle changes that try and help conversion. I'll talk about that. The third one, which is actually pretty straightforward and actually can give you a very big return, is geographic-based personalization. Obviously, what you're saying when you're trying to recruit, say, international students might be a very different message to in-state students. If somebody lives in your city or your area, they know potentially your campus, but maybe somebody from out of state mightn't. So you can target different content. Another example we're seeing some universities starting to do is, particularly where people are interested in switching or changing university, is if you spot somebody coming from either a feeder school or another university, you could target them either for recruitment or potentially to transfer. Behavioral targeting. This is where people do particular actions, and this is a big one in e-commerce, and you'll see it. Amazon. So this is where I think is a really good example actually of where Amazon type personalization and profiling doesn't really work very well. And as you can imagine, you're clicking around Amazon and you can almost start to see the logic of how it's personalizing it. You can see the products come up at the bottom of your screen. And I think this is the challenge, because higher ed is such a long, it's a relatively long cycle. The problem is just because someone has clicked on one button or they found a page very deep on your website, maybe in the research area relating to a particular topic. What can end up happening is in higher ed, you have a lot of false negatives because websites are large, there's lots of ways to come in, it's a long buying cycle, to use that phrase. Behavioral targeting, while it's the number one technique in e-commerce, it's the one that doesn't apply very well. And that's what I would definitely say is, obviously, we as Terminal 4 do some great stuff in this area, but what I would definitely say is solutions that have come from the DNA of e-commerce, this is where it doesn't quite apply. Another area of personalization is where they've come from. You know that they've come from, say, a particular social media campaign. So maybe you know that they've clicked on a banner ad that says, hey, there's a free laptop if you sign up for a particular, if you apply by this time. So what you might want to do is carry that message through, or you might have a campaign about amazing outcomes or some brilliant case studies. And again, you want to personalize the content because you know that they've seen a particular campaign, a banner ad or a social campaign. The last part, I'm not going to really go into detail today other than to mention it, and it's A/B testing. And sometimes it does use some of these techniques here, but what it really is about is doing quick tests, changing a button, personalizing how a picture looks. And it's a good way to just do quick little tests to see how something might work and how you might put in place a stronger, more permanent personalization campaign. So actually then to go into just some browser examples here, if you bear with me just for a second, I am going to share my screen. Perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you firstly one of the examples that we did, as you probably gathered from my accent, Irish. And one of the projects we worked on many years ago, but actually we've been working with them for over a long period of time, is actually Aer Lingus, the Irish national airline. But I think airlines are actually a really good example of where they use personalization, because typically you're telling them through your searches here where you're going, where you want to go from, and where you're coming from and where you're going. But the reason, this is a really good example of geographic targeting. So people say to us sometimes, oh, Terminal 4, can you show us an example of a personalized site? And I would say the little challenge can be, is that if you're doing personalization well, you don't know you're being personalized to, if that's the right grammar. So in this case here, it's a good example here of where I have, this is from Boston to different destinations. And if any of you see some good deals here, I hope I'm going to get some commission out of this. But you can see there, very straightforward. It's talking about Boston to various different locations, and you can go to visit the lovely Cliffs of Moher there, which actually a beautiful place. Now, what I'm going to do, the great thing about this particular instance is you can then change where your airport is. So because the reason what they found was that some places it didn't clearly tell, they weren't sure exactly where their local airport was. The good example, the reason why I show this is because you can actually change the geography yourself, and you can actually see the different personalization experience. So here you're saying, look, you could, from England, from Manchester, you can now travel to Ireland, has different offers, and actually the content is almost entirely different, except for really the header and the footer. It's a good example, and I think what we are finding actually in some recent projects, some fine work that we're doing in the UK, we're actually giving some users, when they visit the website, actually the option of slightly changing their personalization rules. So we're trying that out on a few projects and seeing how it works. So actually then to move over into higher education, this is Terminal 4 University. I'm going to show you just some 3 quick examples that have worked quite well in higher ed. The first one is, we're finding that for those of you who are looking at revamping your course catalog, we have a webinar, which Mallory will share the URLs of all our webinars later on. We're finding that students are wanting to know exactly a lot more information about the majors, the degrees, the course information. And a lot of sites are now introducing what we call a find a course, or searching for a major. And say, for example, in here, now, It's rotating through my little banners here. So okay. So what I'm going to do here is when I go into science and I go undergraduate, we find that using this to find a course or searching for a major is actually a perfect way of um, listening, because it's almost like you're looking over somebody's shoulder and seeing what they're interested in. So here, for example, I'm figuring out that they're interested in this particular degree. But if I go back to the home page, you can then start targeting some of the content. So initially, the carousel banner for around science is now first. We've now then have some quick links down the bottom here that are more related to undergraduate. Obviously, this is a very sort of blunt level of personalization, but we found little techniques such as slightly tailoring things like our campus visit. Instead of saying, come and visit our engineering school, because you know maybe they're interested in engineering. So the next one I'm going to show you quickly here, for example, is if I'm interested in a short program, maybe a summer program here, and I click in, and again, I'm interested in, here's just a simple course, a community yoga class. Okay, and then again, I go back to the home page here, and you'll see it's starting to use different banners, and this one has a call to action saying the closing date is in 3 days' time. It's this sort of, we find this sort of looking at people interacting with the course catalog. I would certainly say that your course catalog is one of the things that I think needs more attention in a lot of universities. It depends on where in the world you are, but I think students are really interested in the detail behind the majors. Another technique that you can use, so this is some behavioral type personalization, but it's basically finding out a persona, whether it's undergraduate or also the topic areas you're interested in. So what happens, say you send out an alumni email. An alumni email is an interesting one because it's hard to sort of know if someone is a member of your alumni community by them visiting your website. So what I'm going to do is imagine you've sent out an alumni email. You can seed the URLs that are sent out to people. In this case, I'm just going to bring you into like a little landing page. It doesn't have much on it at all, but it's just like a page that would, and these could be all the links from an email going out to your alumni community. And if they click on any of those links, for example, it then can tag them. So this link would not be accessible by anybody else on the site. It's only through the alumni email. So if you know that they've clicked on that, when they come back, you can then start saying, hey, I know you're part of, I'm going to now, would you like to name a library after you or something like that? So it's these sort of techniques are actually having a massive impact. So I now know this person is a member of alumni community. If I have more data and I can link it in with the CRM, it's you can then start doing things like, well, what year do they graduate, from what area, and so on. So there's just some very quick examples today. I'm very, very happy after even the webinar to talk through some of these in a bit more detail for those of you who are more marketing technology orientated and things you can do with like linking in with CRM data. But yeah, that's hopefully gives you a quick little feel for some of the things you can do. What I would say is start small and try little things out. And by the way, I know, say for example, without our system, you can do this across a whole website, but actually starting small is a good place, and even landing pages, you could just try some of these things out. So just to go back to the slides there, really what I want to just quickly finish up on is some of the quick little things to think about when you are planning out your different personas and your different ways of content targeting. What I would firstly say, here's an example, and this is some terminology that we like to use, but it's things to think about. Firstly is do not have too many personas. Often when we talk to clients or people that we just like chatting to about this area, they sometimes overthink the number of personas, but you have to realize that it's going to have an impact on your content generation. So keep it simple. In this case, what we say, there are indicators. So the first thing at the indicators is the location, and then maybe you're getting information in from your course search. What then is you create segments of types of, like almost like little Lego blocks. So in this case, I want to put people into a bucket of being, say, from Australia or New Zealand or from Fiji. Okay, there are two different segments. And then another thing you might say, well, if they do a certain thing in the search facility, I want to put them into the undergraduate bucket. And then you create these personas, even on paper, which say, well, we want to target a particular piece, a particular banner or a particular call out to undergraduates visiting from Fiji, Australia, and New Zealand. So plan these out. But if you start to get too many, then that's an alarm bell. Keep it simple and start small. Looking at the next slide here, I think these are some of the things to think about when you're planning this out on paper, and some terminology we use, but I think it's a good place to start. Firstly, obviously, a visitor is a person visiting your site. An indicator should be a signal that the website provides to sort of say, this is something I know about this person. You then want you to use that indicator to put them into a segment, and a persona is made up of many segments. And then from that, you deliver your personalized content. But I would say is plan this out, and if you start having too many, just remember that, for example, if you create a persona for, say, for example, level of study, which could be undergraduate, postgraduate, short programs, continuing development, alumni, staff, and students, what's there, 6 or 7 or so, then you say, well, I want to personalize by topic. So what course area they're interested in, engineering, fine arts, easily you could have 20 of those. And then you say, well, actually, then we want to target it by geography. If you start multiplying those out, you're going to have a lot of content, and you're going to have a lot of work. So definitely think of, well, of those, which are the important ones, link it back to your strategic plan. But on that note, I think that's something that I think is worth moving on in terms of the slides. I suppose with all of this, with great power comes great responsibility. You do have a lot of power and you can do a lot of things, but don't sort of like, it's easy on paper to create a lot of really good ideas, but you need to be able to fulfill and show results. So with that, I would definitely say that it does have massive potential, and we're seeing absolutely fantastic uplifts in conversion. And we're really enjoying, actually, I have to say, really enjoy working with clients, helping them. Because you see them have such a great improvement. But you need to make sure that you're not going to go fall into a big hole of complexity. And I think it's all about making sure and planning it out in advance. With our tool and some other tools you can use for personalization, you can do things pretty quickly, but often I always say, like, let's plan it out on paper or whiteboard first. And that's absolutely the big the big thing I would say takeaway is just don't jump in, plan it out on paper, and link it to goals that you as a university want to achieve.
And with that, we are going to jump into another giveaway, this time for 2 books. Although before we do this, Piero, I want to throw a question your way because it's really relevant to what you were just talking about having multiple personas. And so one of our viewers asked, if you are someone that, say, maybe fits into different buckets, right? So let's say someone's an employee and they're also in a graduate program. How would you kind of navigate that from a personalization perspective? Are you able to, like, essentially elevate certain items within personalization to take precedence over others, or what are your recommendations there?
Yeah, it's very tricky. No, absolutely it's an really interesting question, and I think the challenge is there's going to be lots of exceptions, right? So I think you have to go for the areas where it's going to have the biggest return. Okay, right. Keeping that in mind, I suppose my main golden rule was, okay, you can think of all of these exceptions of somebody who's like this and like that, but what I would say is the biggest thing to keep in mind is don't alienate anyone. And what I mean by that really is, for example, and this is where you can almost be too dramatic with your personalization. What you wouldn't want to do is go, know you're a member of staff, and then suddenly all the links to all the other stuff disappear. You want to make sure that remove stuff so much so that they can never get back sort of reverse them out of a particular avenue. So I would say is, yeah, look, there are these exceptions and you can think through for them, but I would say is just make sure when you're testing them and you're going through the examples that you're saying, okay, well, if I was this type of person, would I be able to actually sort of still find what I want? It might just
Right.
be not as easy, but you shouldn't have it that it's suddenly all those links disappear. And um, and so sometimes, by the way, you see this example on some commercial websites when you're visiting an international website and you want to see it, for example, like I travel a lot, right? And my laptop, sometimes it confuses people because it sort of says, well, where are you actually? So say maybe I'm on an e-commerce site in the US, but it thinks maybe I'm in Ireland for whatever reason. And it's now the bad implementations of personalization don't allow me to go, actually, no, I want to correct that, like Aer Lingus. I want to, actually, I am in um, or maybe I'm in Dublin today and I'm going to be in Boston tomorrow and I need to buy something, So what you do is it needs to have a way of you sort of still finding what you're looking for.
Hmm.
Sometimes I see it as being a mess where they like lock you out. It's almost like, no, no, we see you coming from Ireland. We're not going to let you see what Americans can see. Maybe there's some secret products or something like that that I'm not allowed to buy. But so I would definitely say is just make sure the rules allow for some flexibility because personalization isn't. You can't 100% really guarantee that you've got it 100 that you've got it
Right.
completely right.
Right. All right. Well, thank you for that answer. And everyone hop back into that chat because I'm going to be taking a look right now. Greg, let's flip that slide. And our next question, what percentage of content watched on Netflix is driven by their personalization engine? So we found out that 35% of Amazon is driven by the recommendations engine. But what about Netflix? Whoa, we had an instant winner, Tony. Ding, ding, ding. I don't know if that was a really good guess or if you were just on top of this stuff, but maybe we read the same article from McKinsey. I don't know. 75% of Netflix is content that comes from the personalization recommendations. So isn't that like wild to think? I'm sure there's plenty of Netflix users on this webinar that we watch so much content that they're putting in front of us because they're learning data and information about us. Awesome. All right, Tony, I will be shooting you a private message to get your mailing address and email in just a moment. Greg, let's keep going.
Yeah, let's dive into the next parts of our agenda. So we've talked about a lot of these things, but planning is an important part of a personalization effort. So we spent some time putting together what we think the prerequisites are for this, things that you need to get started. So big topic areas around content management, around conversions and transactions and measurement. And Piero's mentioned a lot of these, so we'll unpack that a little bit in this section. So the first of these is content management. And I mean that really broadly. So not just your content management system, but that is included, but also governance and content strategy. So you need to have, the technology that you're using to update the website. And there are plenty of institutions where there are some questions about that, or that's in flux, and that's something you want to feel comfortable with, that you have a process and a set of tools that work. From a governance standpoint, you want to know that the ownership of the website is cared for and what the workflows and processes are around that. And then when it comes to content strategy, there's a discipline around how content is created for the website, because as Piero mentioned, personalization leads to more content, so we need to know how that works. So to unpack these areas a little bit, some top level thoughts of the things that are maybe the most important in each of these areas. Obviously, it's a really broad set of things that we deal with every day on our websites. So a single content management system, for at least for the top level site, is going to simplify your life. If you're moving between systems, personalization isn't the best thing to undertake. You want a flexible set of templates that you can use so that you're really leveraging that system to do things like content reuse. You want to have a structure for managing media files. So if personalization is going to include images or documents, you're going to have more of those. So you want a structure for that. Taxonomies are something that are often a part of this for content reuse or for tagging content to make that the process of using it easier. And naming conventions. So as you can imagine with any website, this happens to us all the time, the more content there is, the more important it is to be able to find it and identify it and reuse it. And we'd only be adding to that in personalized efforts. So in the governance area, somebody needs to own the website. It's pretty fundamental, and senior leadership are committed to that. That's a big part of having control of the website in general. But also that resources are in place, dedicated to the website, and that the roles are pretty well understood. So everybody always wants and needs and could use more resources. But if resources are really an issue, just keeping the website up and going, you can assume that personalization is going to take a little bit more of those resources. Processes and workflow to manage content are part of this, so that you have a process that you're using now that you can add to and co-opt for things that require personalized content. And the Wild West has mostly been tamed. So lots of institutions where things are siloed, there are multiple systems, multiple units working on things. And when you're in that kind of an environment and you don't have control over all the pieces of the web, then it can be hard to do something like personalization. And then in the area of content strategy, a lot of these go hand in hand with governance, obviously, but policies, processes, and guidelines for content. Information architecture work is part of this that teams are doing and have implemented. Editorial calendars so that the people are updating content on a regular basis. And the content creators have training in key aspects of what that means, right? So if we're creating personalized content, we really want to be making sure that we have folks doing that with some expertise in what they're creating. So the next prerequisite, transactions or conversions. And I don't mean this necessarily in the measurement sense, but just in the ability for your visitors to conduct these transactions on your website. Because in higher ed, a lot of our transactions are in third-party systems. So CRM, the common application or another online application, event calendars, alumni databases, a lot of different places that these things live. So, how seamless and polished is the experience for your people to do these things in a way that stays on brand and has a consistent visitor experience, because that's going to impact the visitor and their experience in your conversions as much as your personalization is if those experiences are poor. So the ability to measure is going to be part of that too. So when you're dealing with third-party systems, it can be a challenge to measure those. And then you want to have the ability to use calls to action on the site. So whether this is part of your templates or part of your content strategy, where you are directing visitors to take an action that you want them to take is something you need to be able to manipulate and control as part of your personalization experience, because that's really what's going to lead to a conversion. So conversions themselves, we have a typical list of some of these on the left here. Request information forms are kind of the low-hanging fruit or the obvious one, but it's not always trivial to make these work. So there's an example here from Texas Women's University where they use a third-party system for the request information form. It's embedded and styled into the content management system. So we have a nice, consistent visitor experience for the transaction. And then you can hook up measurement to it and use that, since this is likely a conversion that you might personalize around, right, for prospective students to get them to request information. So just keep in mind that if your transactions are clunky or off-brand or not fully online, then those can be more pressing issues than personalizing the experience. And finally, measurement as a prerequisite. Everybody has their Google Analytics tracking, but measurement is going to be a key part of using personalization as a tool. So doing things like event tracking in Google Analytics, setting up goals for your conversions in the tool so you can track those. If you're using email marketing, using campaigns or the URL builder within Google Analytics to help track particular efforts and measure conversions, and having a tool like A/B testing in your pocket, like Piero mentioned, those things are going to help you tailor your personalization efforts, test them, measure the results, and see how things work to make them better. And in a lot of ways, obvious why measurement is important, but the level of effort for personalization is high. So any information you can have about how that's working and what works well and what doesn't, so you can avoid going down a rabbit hole of something that isn't effective, is important. You need to have a way to assess your success. Piero mentioned that some personalization efforts could cause harm. So if you don't have information about that in terms of measurement, you may not realize that you're causing a problem for conversions in one area by boosting them in another, or causing a bad visitor experience for some of your visitors. So, it requires some feedback in terms of measurement to make personalization successful. So let's talk about our last agenda item, which is planning for personalization. What are the things that are part of the planning process? Obviously these can be projects unto themselves. They can start small, they can be very large, but what are the component parts as we see them? Well, one of those that we've talked about several times is segmenting. So you need to identify segments of visitors who offer opportunities for conversions. And the segments will go into personas we'll talk about here in a minute. So Pierre has mentioned a few of these. There are a number of possible segments. You can use your Google Analytics to mine, for interesting areas or to validate, some of your thoughts. There's some pretty obvious, areas to consider targeting, with alumni or with prospective students. But you'll want to narrow your focus. And so using these segments help narrow the focus to something that's a little bit more manageable, using some of the different dimensions of data that you have, in Google Analytics already, or even in some of your offline systems about audiences that you feel like you could have something to gain by doing personalization. So we need to identify conversions. So for any audience segment or segments that you want to personalize, what are the conversions a visitor would complete? Are they already being tracked on your website? Do you have baseline data, or can you establish baseline data before you deploy personalization so that you can measure before and after? You really think about what results you need your visitors to see from your visitors when you implement personalization. So, tying things back to some conversions in the measurement is an important piece. Obviously, you're going to need a tool for personalization. So how are you going to deploy, personalized content to folks? So there are some general thoughts that we have here. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. There are content management system-based tools that integrate with your content. And an advantage of this is that if you can do something within your content management system, you have a lot of your content already there. You're sort of adding to it, or you have the opportunity to use existing content to personalize. And it's easy to do because it's there. But there are also third-party tools that plug into your existing website that can help with this. As Piero stressed, and I echo the same, having the ability to start small and build is something that's important. So there are some really very complex ways of or tools for personalization, and it can be a big project, a big mess if you don't have the resources. But you need something that fits your the skill set and the resources that you have within your team. And then back to personas. So we talked about segments and how segments come together into personas. You want to start with your priority audience segments. And, a few of them are here on the screen, right? Prospective students, alumni. But we want to craft real world use cases based on those segments. So what segments make these up? What does an actual visitor look like? Who we're going to create content for? And a lot of times it helps to keep these really narrow. So here's a prospective student who's interested in nursing or nursing program, or interested in the arts, student athlete or frequent visitor, those different segments that can come up that we can use to create these personas that now we can target and say, okay, we can, craft a personalization experience for these specific visitors or groups of visitors that share these common traits. So, it really is important to keep things narrow and start small. If you were to do this for an entire higher education website, it would be a huge effort, and that's sort of intimidating. So starting with something small and it's useful is definitely the best way to go. And then the last piece of the puzzle, and this is a lot to do on one slide, but it's design the personalization experience itself. So this is where you have your tool, you have your audience segment, you have your conversions, you have all the things that you need to now craft that into a personalized experience. So what is the content that you need? What does it look like? How does it integrate into the website? How does the tool deploy the business rules to the audiences coming in to show them content? And then how are we going to measure it? So you'll want to test that and verify it works. Test it with your personas and your use cases, and deploy the experience and measure performance. And then you set up this cycle of being able to revise and refine the experience based on the results. So the particulars of this, of course, depend on your scope, your tools, the level of effort that you can apply to this. But it can scale pretty well to start small and obviously grow to be pretty big, like the examples we talked about with Amazon and Netflix. So some final thoughts to kind of wrap up everything we've talked about here today. I'd emphasize remembering those prerequisites, things around content management, transactions, and measurement, and thinking about where you stand with those things and making sure you have what you need across those areas before you get started. As Piero said, start small with lightweight segmenting and personas that are narrow, that give you something to experiment with, and having the right tool that facilitates you doing that can make all the difference. And then measure and test and refine. So it can be one of those things that once you really start thinking about it, seems too big to get started with. Obviously, there's a lot of buzz and interest this year in higher ed and personalization. So I think there's going to be a lot of this, and the folks who are most successful are going to be able to dive in and start with something, learn from it, and then do more of it. So we hope that this gives you some information to get started with that.
Awesome.
And so I'll bring Mallory back in, and we've still got some time for questions.
Perfect. And we stuck to our promise of leaving 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, although we will stick around. There's already some really great questions coming through. And I have to say, there's a lot of really fun chatter early on around carousels. So Greg, if you have a chance to scroll back up, I think you might really enjoy it.
I missed some of the carousels, but they are fun.
Good.
Mallory, if I can just add an interesting thing about carousels, I saw one of them about in relating to trying to satisfy internal politics. We had one example of where one client, they kept getting asked by the president of the university's office for something like really ridiculous, and like obviously, the digital marketing team are always, how could they be experts in this, right? And so what they did was they set up a personalization rule that only the president's office got to see the change that they were requesting. So, and they didn't get found out. I thought that I thought it was very bit dangerous, but yeah, so they kept being persistent to ask for the stupid requirement. So what they did was they set up a personalization rule. They got the IP address ranges of the president's office's computers and did the change, but only they could see it. So there you are. That's some of the things you can get up to with this sort of technology and ideas.
That's hilarious. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. I can believe it. That's amazing. Oh, that was such a great story. Thank you for sharing that. I think I can see the chat room on my other screen like, oh my gosh. Oh. Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right. So before we dive into the questions, I do want to share a couple details about these resources that we have here. Of course, I'm going to chat these links out in just a minute, and this info will be in the follow-up email that you receive, because remember, we're recording today's session and we'll send out a link to the recording, the slide deck, and all of these resources on Thursday or Friday. So let me run through them really quickly, and then we'll get into Q&A. So the first one is Terminal 4 has put together this great resources page, and you can find webinars and other content about personalization and measurement from a far more technical point of view, as Piero says. So that's a really great place to check out for some additional resources. Now, I also included myth-busting websites because this is research that we conducted last year with Chegg, and the resulting presentation and white paper that you can download explores really significant disconnects between what prospective teens value when they visit your website and what we as higher ed marketers and enrollment professionals think that they value. It's really interesting. I know a number of folks on here have already accessed that, but if you haven't, I will chat that link out in just a moment. And finally, if you're ready to improve your site this year and you want to start with a quick checkup, we can do that for you, and we can deliver a roadmap toward improving your site's visual design, content, user experience, and help you start thinking through some of these areas of personalization. So we'll send out links in just a moment, and please don't forget, I'll also be shooting out a link for our webinar evaluation. That feedback is so valuable, and it gives Greg and Piero a sense of how they did today and if the webinar met your expectations. All right, let's move into Q&A. And Piero, first question is for you. Um, you have already seen this in the chat room, but some folks were talking about the various third-party tools that Greg had made reference to, and you had mentioned that you'd be happy to share some examples. So if you don't mind, let's kick off Q&A with that.
Yeah, I think that the first thing to say is that so there's two types, as Greg mentioned. You can obviously have personalization built in, like the CMS, like your own, or you can have third-party tools, right? But it's important to know the difference, because there's a bit of a technical difference, right? The third-party tools, what they tend to do is they use a little JavaScript component that you plug into the bottom of your page, like you can't usually deploy it using Google Tag Manager because of the order it processes things. What it does is it basically changes, getting slightly technical, it changes the DOM and changes your HTML after it's been delivered from the server. What it does do, what I would say is those plugin tools I'm going to mention, what they tend to do is it does add extra load time onto your page. And I would say also, it cannot take advantage of content that's already in your system. For example, Greg mentioned this, but a good example is if you have a big library of news or really good articles on research that's going on at your university, it would be great to be able to personalize using that body of content. So there's ones like the big ones out there are things like Optimizely is a tool you can plug in. They have a free version you can use to play around with. It does get expensive pretty quickly, but it is something you can play with. It's probably somebody who knows a bit of JavaScript, you'd get a lot out of that. On the higher end, things like Marketo do things you can plug in, and they do a wider solutions around marketing automation as well. There's some sort of quick and easier little tools that you can plug in as well. But I would think that they're sort of a similar type sort of setup to Optimizely. So I'd play around. If anybody wants to, like even on Twitter, just send me. I can point you and maybe I'll come up with a little bit of a list afterwards. But some of these tools are out there. What I would say is when you're looking at things like Marketo or HubSpot and products like this, they come with a lot of components, right? Out there are specific ones that just do personalization. My view is, though, is that it's good for trying things out, for like if you need to do wide scale personalization all of the time. They're good for saying, well, I want to try something out on the home page for a period of time. I want to maybe adjust something. So it's just something to consider from that point of view. So yeah, I hope that gives a little bit of an insight. And I mentioned a few products there.
Yeah, I think it does. And I'd add HubSpot to the list of marketing automation tools as well. That's another great one. Greg, any other tools you would add to that list?
Not offhand, but yeah,
Yep.
there's certainly, a little research. And a lot of those are really e-commerce focused, or they start with that. And so, some of those you find when you're looking for more e-commerce specific sorts of tools.
Right. All right, Piero, next question's back at you. So you talked a lot about different types of personalization. So if an institution was to start with just one, what's the most obvious low-hanging fruit where they should start?
The homepage. Very simply, the homepage, it's often, as we talked about earlier on, it's the place where everybody tries to cram everything. And in it, I would just focus on your calls to action. Personalizing those based on geography, and if you can't, even undergraduate, postgraduate, student level. Yeah. That's the best place. I would say the quick answer is that.
Makes sense. All right, a question from Twitter. Jordan's asking, what would be some examples of initial measurable conversions for higher ed websites? Greg, I'm going to toss that one over to you.
Yeah, a few of them are some of the things that we talk about on websites, regardless of personalization, right? So request information, campus visits, applications are obvious, but a lot of times that's a little more challenging to do, or there are multiple steps in the process. But even things like, engagement with certain types of activity, if you've got a, prospective student and there's certain information you want them to see or certain programs you want them to see based on, something, you could have conversions that are not tied to filling out a form or that sort of transaction. So I think, in general, we're sort of bad at measuring, outlining conversions and measuring them in higher ed. But I think to do personalization right, you really need to identify some that you can measure and influence with the personalization you're working on.
Yeah. And we're kind of thinking about data in kind of three buckets too. Kind of you've got your key conversions at the top, those are your requests for information, apply, contact a counselor, and then you've got kind of that 201 level of the more meaningful engagements, maybe stickiness on key pages, interactive features, your search terms, and then that lower level, which is sometimes referred to as vanity metrics, but I like to think of them as insightful metrics because you can learn a lot from things like the bounce rate or the devices or the location. And sometimes those are, correct me if I'm wrong, the places where you might want to start with personalization because, location-based might be easier to start building things around than some of the other areas. Piero, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, my view is very simple, right? Is I think that I think the biggest benefit you can have is actually putting in a monetary value on your conversions. I think I would I think putting even just putting a monetary value on every conversion when you're making the business case to senior management. Like, can people hear me okay? A few people in the
Yeah,
chat room
you
say the
you got a
audio
little
is a bit.
choppy for a second, Piero, but you seem to be back now.
I'm talking too quickly. That's probably it. So I think I would say, yeah, is put a monetary value on your calls to action, measure those, and then you can use that when you're making the business case to senior management. And try and get that monetary value, work with your finance people to say, well, how valuable is an inquiry? How valuable is an applicant? Because then when you're making the business case, you can say, we saved $200,000.
Right.
Can we have a little bit of that to do more of this, please? I think that's what I think is the most important when it comes to measuring.
Yeah. That's a very business approach to it too. I think we, in the business world, like often thinks of cost per lead, value of a lead, and I think it's time higher ed starts thinking about site visitors or maybe applicants in a similar way to help justify doing some of this stuff. All right, there was a really great question from Alan in the chat. He said he's looking for a rough estimate on the amount of time it takes to set up an initial test of personalization, like from zero to actually having results. Piero, what do you think?
There's a little bit of, it depends on your technical infrastructure. But if you wanted to say do a landing page, just that slight, not knowing what content management system you're on. If you're on ours, brilliant. We can set it up pretty quickly. I would say is firstly do your planning, but the technical setup you could actually set up in probably about an hour to do some basic personalization. But I'd say is setting up your personas, setting up your, I think what you want to do is spend a little bit of time. I think you want to spend like a day or two just planning and setting up your personas. But if you wanted to do like a quick example, which is I want to personalize based on geography, based on a couple of things, depending on what, could be, once you have the basic setup, it could be, 10, 15 minutes, or depending on your architecture, you might need to spend more time. So it could be a couple of hours to set that up at most. But it's sort of a hard question to answer without knowing the technical architecture.
Right.
That people are on. But it once you have it set up, then it should be just almost like potentially a content editor or marketing or recruitment person with just literally it's just selecting rules. And I think anyone can do that. You just need to do a bit of the setting up at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And my guess is that the answer to this question might be dependent on an institution's, site and the resources that they have. But Catherine was wondering, what is a rough gauge for the extra resources needed in order to just feed that personalized website once it is set up? Do you think if you had to ballpark it, is that a 10% increase, a 20% increase in staff time?
I think what you need to do is you need to not run away with all your ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I that's my view, and maybe Greg, you have maybe you might have a view on this. My view is it shouldn't actually add on too much extra, but you should be selective about the things you want to personalize. And if you can properly measure and show the value, then it shouldn't cut into your current day. You should be very clear if you're measuring properly, which I know is tough in higher ed, right? But say you can at least measure and use that information to communicate to your senior management, it should be, well, if we got a little bit of extra resource, we could do more of this good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say is, look, I think if you're very selective about the personalization things you want to achieve, it shouldn't actually take up too much time. Where we can make a mistake though is you think of all the permutations and you say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, well, I now need to create 120 versions of our homepage. And I think that's just a slippery slope. Um, that's a difficult situation if you go down that route.
Spiral really fast, huh?
Yeah,
Greg,
exactly.
anything
So
to
be
add?
very selective.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a mindset around doing it in a lightweight and a sustainable way
Mm-hmm.
that I think is going to, in the next few years, we're going to see that that the job of managing the website and doing this kind of marketing evolves to include that's part of running a higher ed website involves personalizing for these audiences, and so we're going to find ways to do it where it doesn't increase the resources. It just changes what we spend our time on. People are reducing the size of their websites, so we aren't managing as many pages. And we're not talking about adding pages. We're talking about being smarter with the content that we create, or maybe spending more time on the content that has the most value and less time on the content that doesn't. And we're going to see that kind of shift. And I think thinking about it that way, it's not adding resources or adding a job. It's adding some tasks and changing some tasks. But there's some other things that hopefully we can do less of in conjunction with
Yeah.
that.
I mean, the one investment we're seeing working out for a lot of places is actually having somebody spend maybe half their role or even a full role, depending what you're doing, is just working on analytics and your goals, and then helping communicate those to the key people around your university. And not just somebody setting up Google Analytics, but actually properly setting up goals, properly measuring, linking that into your strategic plan for your university. And those sort of people, if you're able to make the case for that type of person, then you're able to really figure out, well, what personalization, what other marketing campaigns are going to have the biggest impact. I would say it's the one role you should try and get onto your team, but it's hard, if you're a small college or, like at the moment, everywhere budgets are tight.
Yeah. All right, we have 2 questions left before we wrap up. And the next one's also from Alan. Greg, he's wondering what techniques you might use or recommend to identify the specific segments within Google Analytics.
That's a good question. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but I like to use Google Analytics segments to do that. Where if you haven't experimented with those, you can easily, within the reporting interface, create filters to filter any report that you're viewing. By default, you're viewing all visitors for whatever view you're looking at. But you can use, some of the demographic information, browser, geography, those sorts of things. Or even things like, visitors who came on a certain campaign or have other attributes. And so you can pretty easily create new segments in Google Analytics and use those to report and kind of look at different sections of data. You can also look at some of those side by side, right? So here's a segment, here's another segment. Which of these two, has higher traffic or higher interest for me? And then that may guide, some of the segments that you use for personalization.
Yeah. And the last question comes from Seth, who is wondering if you have examples off the top of your head of institutions that are doing persona level personalization. And if we need to, what we could also do is put some of those in the email that we're going to use to follow up. But Piero, Greg, anything off the top of your head?
Yeah, there's some good example. I mean, there's one. I think what we might do, it might be worthwhile us coming back to. What we're finding is business schools are doing some good examples. We're working on a project at the moment in the United Kingdom for a very large business school. It's about to go live very, very soon. So the problem, as I mentioned earlier on, is sort of talking about as I said, knowing if they're doing personalization or not, because it's sometimes tricky to know whether it's happening. But the one example, and what we'll do, it's due to go live very, very soon. So what we might do is share it around to people
Great.
um, who attended. It's for a particular business school, but they actually have the logic that they have challenges. For example, like they have a Hong Kong and a Shanghai campus. So how do you know where in China, which is the closest campus? So they have the option saying, this is what we think you're interested in, and a user can adjust it. So I think it would be a really good one to share around, because you can actually customize and tweak the personalization rules based on just clicking on a little cog in the corner which says, and you can change some of this sort of stuff. There's other examples, like we're doing a lot of work with Swinburne University down in Australia, and they're doing personalization a lot. And they got a 32% increase uplift in undergraduate student recruitment inquiries within 4 days of implementing it. I'm trying to think of others
Wow.
off the top of my head, but those ones are sort of quick examples.
Yeah.
It could be interesting where we could maybe do a blog post together and show off some of the examples. Because as I said, you don't know perhaps it's being personalized until, if someone's doing it properly, you mightn't even know.
Yeah, one other thing I'll mention is that, in the last several years, we've seen people do this for like accepted students or other specific audiences where, the general public can't, log into those sites and see that content, but there's personalization within some of those. So I know of some examples that have been around a little while. And I think what we're seeing is those sort of techniques that, you're doing a lot of, explicit personalization because you know about those visitors. Now we've got some tools that we can do that, on our home pages, like Piero mentioned, to kind of target a broader audience. And so we're sort of seeing that shift.
Yeah. Great. Well, Piero, Greg, it was a pleasure having you both today, leading this really excellent session. Thank you so much for your time. And attendees, thank you for your time. We really appreciate you taking an hour and 10 minutes out of your day to be here with us. Hopefully you were able to learn something new and interesting that'll make a difference in your work this year. Don't forget, we'll be sending out that post-webinar evaluation really shortly. And we so appreciate your 2 to 3 minutes and filling that out. And keep an eye on your email later this week. You'll get access to this recording and the slide deck. So thanks again. We hope to see you on another session, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, all.
Great. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks.